My brother owns a great camper van that he sometimes lets me borrow. Living just 15 minutes apart in a state known for camping, hiking, and outdoor activities, I asked him last fall if I could use his camper van for a camping trip to a small fishing pond. With the weather turning too cold for comfortable tent camping, the camper van seemed like the perfect choice. I just wanted to spend a few days fishing and enjoying some solitude. I picked up the camper van, drove to the fishing pond, and everything seemed fine. The trail to the pond was obviously not meant for driving, narrow and consisting only of dirt, but I usually saw tire tracks on it, so I knew others used it like I did. This time, however, there were no other vehicles on the trail, and when I reached the pond, there was no one else around. I parked slightly off to the side to be cautious, then set up everything and immediately went fishing. I had a few cans of beer, sat down, and had a genuinely pleasant time. Around 5 p.m., I started packing up, bringing all the gear back to the camper van. As I did so, a pickup truck came down the trail. It was an old rusty truck, weathered by many years, and it didn't have a trailer, just the truck. The windows were covered with dark glass, leading me to believe they might be using the truck for sleeping, which wasn't the most unusual thing I had heard of. They parked on the other side of the site, turned off the headlights, but stayed in the truck. I finished packing into the camper van, and as the night set in, I occasionally glanced out the window to see if the truck was still there, thinking I might introduce myself to avoid making the situation awkward. But there seemed to be no change. It felt a bit strange not exchanging greetings when you drive to a secluded place, but I just continued with my night, got into bed, and fell asleep around 8 p.m. However, at some point during the night, I woke up for a minute, hearing the sound of a car door opening and closing. I remember looking out the window and seeing nothing, then promptly went back to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, I made breakfast and went fishing again. The truck was still there, seemingly untouched, and I hadn't seen or heard anything from them. I spent over 3 hours fishing, without any sign of movement from the truck. In fact, I didn't even see them. When I returned to the camper van in the afternoon, the truck was gone. I didn't pay too much attention, perhaps they just liked night fishing and slept during the day. I drove the camper van back home, still feeling a bit strange. In the following days, I continued with my normal life until my brother called me, asking if I remembered my experience at that fishing pond. He told me that a local elder had encountered a truck with the same description there last year, arriving at night and never seen again. The elder informed him of this and suggested leaving at night. When I heard this, I felt a bit shocked. Maybe the couple was looking for a place, drove the camper van to the fishing pond, and left at night to avoid being seen by others. While I couldn't be sure, I was glad I didn't get overly concerned at the time and went ahead with my plans. This is a story from our camping trip last summer. My friends and I planned a short camping trip, choosing a scenic location not too far from the city. We had 3 tents, each accommodating 2 people. Initially, everything went smoothly, and we set up our tents by the lake, preparing for a wonderful weekend. However, on the second night, things started to get a bit strange. We were sitting around the campfire, chatting and laughter echoing in the night sky. Suddenly, we noticed some peculiar lights on the lake. They weren't stars or distant lights, these lights were moving on the lake and seemed to be getting closer. We all stopped to watch, feeling a bit puzzled. Suddenly, the lights on the lake vanished, as if they disappeared from the lake. We didn't pay too much attention and continued with our campfire activities. However, as the night grew deeper, we began to hear some strange sounds. Sometimes it was a low, guttural voice, and other times it was a faint humming. This made us a bit uneasy, and we started discussing whether we should leave the place. Eventually, we decided to ignore the sounds, believing they might be animals or the wind. However, as the night progressed, things became even more eerie. We heard footsteps resembling human footsteps occasionally coming from the thickets. At that point, we all felt scared. As far as we knew, there were no other campers nearby. We decided to extinguish the campfire, hide in our tents, and keep quiet. Inside the tents, we could still hear those footsteps, sometimes accompanied by muffled voices. The whole night was uncomfortable until the break of dawn. When the sunlight reflected on the lake, we gathered the courage to come out of our tents. However, we immediately noticed some strange things. On the trees by the lake, there were bizarre symbols and markings drawn with an unknown substance. We also found some peculiar footprints by the lake, not resembling those of animals or humans. We couldn't comprehend what had happened, but we decided to leave the place immediately. We packed our belongings, hastily left the campsite, and dared not look back. Throughout the journey back, we discussed the events of that night, trying to find a reasonable explanation. However, to this day, we cannot explain those strange lights, sounds, symbols, and footprints. This experience instilled a sense of awe for the unknown in us and made us realize that some things are inexplicable in the great outdoors. I live near the northwestern Rocky Mountains, and due to my age, I don't camp often, maybe just once a year. I prefer spending time in my backyard, but venturing into the mountains is always worth it. This happened a few years ago, in early fall. I chose a trail that was only a 20-minute drive away. I parked next to a small dirt parking lot and started walking with my backpack. The weather was colder than expected, but the trail was nice. When I reached the camping site, I set everything down and pitched my tent. It was a small open area surrounded by trees, no other tents or anything around, making it seem like I was the only one camping there. The sun was still high, so after a short break, I decided to take a narrow path leading to a mountain viewpoint. Before leaving, I checked online, and it was supposed to be just a 10-minute walk, so I didn't bring much besides a water bottle and my basic backpack. When I got there, I sat down to admire the beautiful scenery for about half an hour. It seemed like no one else had been there, probably because the weather was getting colder. As I prepared to leave, I felt a bit uneasy. Things seemed slightly off when I returned. Everything was not quite as I left it. I checked around for any missing or visibly moved items, but everything was there. Part of me wondered if I was just being paranoid, that everything I felt might be a mistake. For example, I was certain I zipped up the tent before leaving, but when I came back, it was open. It couldn't have been an animal, and there were no signs of anyone else passing through. The obvious answer was that I didn't zip up the tent before leaving, even though I remembered doing it. I tried to relax, set up a chair, moved some rocks to make a fire pit, and as the sun set, the chill set in. I lit up a fire, prepared some tea with the boiling water, and sat there lost in my thoughts. After some time, about an hour, I heard someone walking. I turned towards the direction of the sound, seeming to come from the trail. But now it was too dark to see beyond the open area. As I observed and listened, it sounded like they were heading towards the camping site. After a few seconds of silence, I almost felt like they were watching me from somewhere on the trail. Then the footsteps resumed, coming from the side of the camping site towards the open area. I don't know, now I was a bit scared. The uneasy feeling I had before returned, and now I knew there were others here, but I didn't know if they were here before me or just arrived. That's what made it so unsettling. I didn't know what was happening. Then the footsteps got louder again, from the other side towards the camping site. I shifted my gaze, but in less than a second, I heard another set of footsteps behind me. Both were quiet and subtle. Considering everything that had happened, it was obvious they were trying not to be noticed as they approached. I quickly pulled out my backpack, took out the gun I only carried as a last resort, and stood facing the trees where I could hear one of them approaching. I didn't say anything, afraid that my fear might be evident in my voice, but I knew they could see me in the light of the campfire. I just hoped the gun would make them think twice about what they were doing. Things went quiet. Both sets of footsteps stopped. I looked around, searching for any signs of movement. In a minute with no sound, I started putting things back into my backpack, carefully not taking more than a few seconds to put away my weapon. I hadn't heard them leave, so I knew they were probably still watching me from somewhere. When I packed everything I could into my backpack, I started walking towards the trail, leaving only the tent behind. As far as I could hear, they didn't follow me out. When I had covered some distance, I turned on my flashlight, continuing until I reached the road. In summary, the police would be useless in such a situation. The two individuals never showed themselves, and nothing actually happened. Don't get me wrong, it was clear they were planning something ominous, but based on current information, it wasn't enough to take action. But after encountering this situation and seeing others go through similar ones, I don't think I'll go there alone again. This happened in the summer of this year. My best friend Jonah and I were both in college, and we shared a love for outdoor activities. We often went hiking together and even planned a camping trip by the lake for this summer. There's a lake not far from us, just a few hours drive away. We're not camping experts, but we know what we're doing and stay within safe limits. We set out in the morning, prepared for a 2-night camping adventure. Despite the hike taking longer than expected, we reached the lakeside around noon. There are hundreds of paths leading to the lake, and since it's vast with many camping spots, it's rare to encounter others. We preferred solitude, so it was reassuring to find no one around when we arrived. For the first hour, we rested and then set up our tent by the tree line just off the beach. The sun was setting as Jonah built a fire, and I went to gather more dry branches to keep it going. As I ventured not far from our tent, I suddenly heard a noise up ahead. Looking in that direction, despite the darkening sky, I could make out most of the trees, and there seemed to be someone in the distance. I stared for a few seconds, confirming there was indeed someone moving in the woods. I quickly returned to the campsite and informed Jonah. We weren't scared, just finding it odd to spot someone right where we were. It would have been different if they were walking along the beach, but going straight through the woods, even off the path, was peculiar. 15 minutes passed, the sun now below the horizon, and the woods covered in darkness. We heard footsteps approaching. After a moment, a man appeared in the light of our fire. He looked around 30, with a beard and shoulder-length hair, but I immediately felt uneasy about him. He smiled, then asked if we knew the way to a specific place. I didn't recognize the name, but it sounded like a trail. "Sorry, not sure where that is," I said softly. The man kept smiling, just looking at us, then turned and walked back into the woods without saying a word. I looked at Jonah, both of us feeling uneasy and puzzled. After confirming he had left, Jonah asked if it was the same person I saw, but I wasn't sure, though it likely was. After dinner, we tried to rationalize why he approached us, the only reasonable explanation being that he might need help after sunset. However, he didn't seem desperate, asking for directions as if everything was normal. If he was truly desperate, it should have been evident, and he wouldn't have left after a single question. Both of us started feeling a bit scared, so we let the conversation fade and allowed the fire to die down as we approached sleep. I tried to lie there, at least for an hour, just listening to the sounds of the woods. But there was a strange feeling preventing me from closing my eyes for too long without feeling tense. Then, about 2 hours later, I heard the sound again, footsteps coming toward our tent. I shouted Jonah's name, and he rushed out just as the footsteps retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Jonah came out only when the footsteps had receded, saying he knew something was wrong when I called his name. That night, we packed up our things, tiredly waited for dawn, and then left the woods. We didn't know who that man was or what he wanted. If I hadn't stayed alert, we might have never left that part of the woods.